Hey guys, this is Ken Klippenstein with TYT Investigates. I'm here with Richard Cohen, the president of the prestigious Southern Poverty Law Center. They do great work. We're here to talk about the challenges to voters getting to the booths tomorrow in the hotly contested race between Roy Moore and Doug Jones. So I wanted to put to you, what are some of the challenges? Are there any dirty tricks you're seeing being employed to try to prevent people from turning out to the polls?
Well, you know, Ken, Alabama has a long and ugly history of voter suppression, and it continues in different forms today. You know, first, there's no same-day registration in Alabama. There's no early voting in Alabama. You have to have an excuse even to get an absentee ballot. We have, unfortunately, a new voter ID law that I think will suppress voter turnout. Mr. Merrill, the Secretary of State, he smiles on television, but quite frankly, he stabs voters in the back routinely. This summer, for example, he rendered over 300,000 voters inactive. He declared them inactive. You know, kind of a term that I think was, first, his list was inaccurate itself. People got to the polls. There was tremendous confusion. I think a lot of people were discouraged. We have a new law in Alabama that tries to remedy partially our ugly history of felon disenfranchisement. Secretary Merrill has done nothing to inform county officials and potential voters about it. You know, there's just a whole host of problems, and, you know, it's our great fear that people won't, you know, understand that they have an opportunity to participate in this election and all others.
So you brought up the Secretary of State of Alabama. I just spoke with him last night, and he assured me that they're not going to have any problems. Everything's going to go fine. And then I put it to him, you know, are there problems with lines? Are they going to be able to access things? And his response to me was that they have iPads now, and that greatly enhances the efficiency of the process. How accurate do you think that is? Are there going to be lines? Do they have adequate resources staffed at these various polling locations to be able to get people where they need to go in a timely fashion?
You know, quite frankly, I'm not concerned about lines this time, because I think overall turnout is going to be relatively low compared to what it would be in a presidential election. So I don't think that lines are going to be a problem. You know, I think there are other things, though, that are going to probably discourage many voters, particularly African Americans, from going to the polls. Mr. Merrill this summer made a lot of noise about prosecuting people for crossover voting, a lot of fanfare about that. It amounted to nothing. The only lasting impact has been to cast a pall over populations that have not traditionally been welcomed at the polls. So I think there are a lot of devices that the state has used. You know, we're living in the horse and buggy era in Alabama, and Secretary Merrill has done precious little to move us forward. He'll do things like, oh, that's the state law, it's the state law. Well, John, if it's wrong, why don't you put in a statute to try to remedy it? Why don't you advocate for better laws? Why don't you do something to clear up the confusion about who's inactive and what they need to do to make sure they get a chance to vote in the polls? Why don't you make sure that local voting officials are educated on voting procedures? You know, he simply smiles, says he can't do any more, and you know, it's disappointing to me.
Well, you mentioned the need to educate the people working at these polling stations. What do they need to know? What do they perhaps not know?
Well, you know, we have it's a widely dispersed, decentralized system, and people are poorly trained. You know, for example, in the primary election, you know, people would show up and they were told they were inactive. Well, what did that mean? You know, then some people were improperly told they could take a provisional ballot. You know, so it was tremendous confusion. And the Secretary of State's office has done nearly enough, first, to inform the general public about who can vote, how to register, to make it easier for them, to ensure that people who were previously disenfranchised by our felony disenfranchisement law know that they can vote. He should stop talking about prosecuting people who exercise the franchise, and he should do much more to bring Alabama into the 21st century.
Yeah, so you've mentioned a few different people groups here who are affected by these, you know, various tactics. Could you talk a little bit about the demographics of the people that really get hit hardest by these practices in terms of preventing them from being able to get out and vote. Because when I was speaking with someone from the ACLU of Alabama, he told me that it's actually, while perhaps African Americans are hit among the hardest, there are also a lot of lower income individuals of various ethnicities that get hit by this stuff.
Sure. I mean, the two groups or the three groups that are hit hardest are, I would say, African Americans, people in poverty, and of course there's a fair amount of overlap kind of in those groups, the elderly, and of course persons with disabilities and sometimes language barriers. But I think the biggest impact falls on the African American community because it's disproportionately poor. It's disproportionately rural, without access to easy places to register and whatnot. So it's not only African American voters who are likely to be, whose votes are likely to be suppressed, but I think disproportionately so. And of course, those people, the African American population, is the one that has been historically disenfranchised in this state. In 2015, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, the Great March from Selma to Montgomery, and the passage of the 1965 Historic Voting Rights Act. And there was a lot to celebrate for. The people of the Black Belt of Alabama wrote that law with their marching feet, and there was a lot of fanfare. And the problem, of course, is instead of embracing that history and moving forward, Alabama officials seem to still be stuck in the past and are looking for ways to make it more difficult to vote. And, I just wish that they would come into the modern era.
Yeah, so a couple of things you mentioned. You were talking about the Voting Rights Act. Can you talk about living, in a sense, in a post-Voting Rights Act world after the Supreme Court decision? What effect is that going to have on an election of the kind we're going to see tomorrow?
Look, the decision in the Shelby County case relieved places like Alabama and other covered jurisdictions from getting their laws pre-cleared by the Justice Department. The jurisdictions that had to go for pre-clearance were the ones that had a history of blatant discrimination against black voters primarily. So now that law has been declared unconstitutional and the states have free rein to implement voting rights changes. In Alabama had passed a voter ID law but didn't send it to the Justice Department for pre-clearance until after. It didn't send it at all, excuse me. They waited to see what was going to happen in the Shelby County case because they didn't want to be told that the law was unfair. Now the burden shifts. Instead of the Justice Department being able to block the law in advance, groups like the NAACP, LDF have to sue after the fact and put on massive cases, which are very, very difficult, very labor-intensive, very time-intensive, difficult. And so I think a lot of southern jurisdictions in particular have felt as if they have free rein to suppress the vote, places like Texas, people like North Carolina, and unfortunately, places like Alabama.
Can you talk a little bit more about the voter ID law? Because to kind of laypersons, they might hear, well, why don't you have an ID? Can you maybe explain why that's not so simple?
Well, first, voter ID laws are aimed at an illusory, non-existent problem. That's the first thing, where, the idea, this myth of voter fraud, this myth of illegal voting is just that, a myth. There was a study that came out that something like, 2 in a billion votes were, classed illegally. So it's aimed at a non-issue, not a real problem, despite what President Trump says and despite what his Voting Rights Commission with Chris Kobach at the helm says. So first, there's no purpose in the law. Secondly, studies show that these laws have a disproportionate impact on the poor, on African Americans, and, it sounds simple for maybe you and me, people who live in cities, people of means, who have driver's licenses, can easily, go get an ID. But it's not always so easy for people who live in poverty, for people who are unfamiliar with government offices, and those people tend to be African Americans, and that's and the poor and the elderly. That's what the statistics show.
Okay, so I wanted to change gears a bit and talk about the race tomorrow. It appears to be an unusually close race. In the event that there is, such a close outcome, Is there a plan in place for any sort of recount just to verify and authenticate that what is reported at first is in fact correct?
I don't know the answer to that, quite frankly, but I think it's a real question. And I think especially when you're looking at an election that's likely to be very close, voter suppression is an important issue because it might not stop 20% of the people from voting, but it may stop enough to swing the election one way or the other.
Okay, and finally, I kind of want to give the floor to you. Much of media, we're reporting on this from New York, from D.C. We might not get a great sense of on the ground what's happening. What are some concerns that you wish would get more coverage with respect to the election on Tuesday? Well,
look, we're a nonpartisan organization, so I can't comment on the candidates and whatnot. Right. Our hope, though, is that the focus is on getting people out to vote. It's an important election. The national media is here. You're here. And, it would be a shame if, turnout was something in the 20s. I hope it's, something at least halfway between the 20s and what it would be in a presidential election. Because the people of Alabama, every person here deserves to have their voice heard.
Okay, I want to thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much.